This episode of the Creep Street Podcast is brought to you by Martini Coffee Roasters. You know, people always look at me weird when I say I start off every morning with a big old martini. But then I set them straight, and I tell them I'm talking about Martini Coffee Roasters coffee. A delicious coffee made by the Martini family. They roast their coffee using a traditional method of sight and sound to roast those little babies to perfection. And they also sell green coffee beans for those home roasters out there. And right now, fans of the Creep Street Podcast can get 20% off their entire order by using the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Once again, for 20% off your order, use the code CREEPSTREET at martinicoffee.com. Martini Coffee Roasters, the perfect coffee to keep you creeps caffeinated.
You've taken a wrong turn down Creep Street.
Citizens of the Milky Way, this is Maureen Bogey.
And this is Dylan Hackworth.
And you have landed smack dab in the middle of Creep Street Podcast.
Check your GPS. You're here, baby.
That's right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are in for one hell of a ride today, and we cannot wait to share it with you all.
Hell yes.
Please remember to like, rate, subscribe, comment, tell a friend about it, tell your family about it, anything like that. Really helps out the show, and we appreciate it so much. And to be kept up on what we're doing, feel free to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Creep Street Podcast, Twitter at Creep Street Pod. We're also on TikTok, and on our Facebook, we have a separate page called Citizens of the Milky Way. It's just a smaller forum where anyone can post memes, funny stories, articles, anything like that.
Hell yeah.
So we highly recommend you go ahead and check that out. Now, here's the thing about Creep Street. We release episodes once a week, but often once a week is just not enough.
It's not enough for the average populace.
It's true. Sometimes you need a little bit more. You need a little bit more of that stank, a little bit more of that spice.
That's right. Get that spice.
And
this is Dune, baby. Get that spice.
Oh, come on. And the good news is we got a solution for your problem. That's right. It's on patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast. There you can get all sorts of bonus content ranging from movie reviews to short stories ranging all the way up to full bonus episodes. We have 3 separate tiers, $2 a month, $5 a month, and $10 a month. And for each of those tiers, you get bonus content every single month, and it's very, very exciting stuff.
Ooh, yes.
So feel free to check that out at patreon.com/Creep Street Podcast. And speaking of our Patreon,
that's right.
We've actually got a new $10 a month top tier Patreon subscriber.
Stick around to the end of the episode. Cannot wait to give our newest a shout out.
Ooh, I can't wait. Gets me all excited and ready to go.
Hell yeah.
Now, last week we went on a little trip. We checked into the Stanley Hotel. We had one hell of a time talking about the spooky ghosts of the Stanley Hotel, connected to and not connected to The Shining. And
That's
it was
right.
Very, very exciting stuff. But Dylan, this week we've got something a little different for him, don't we?
Oh, yes, we do. Something very weird indeed.
Dylan, would you please let us know what the hell is even going on?
This week we're talking about the Warminster Thing. Ooh, all right, let me gingerly paddle your ass with these sources.
Oh, please.
The first and my main source was a book entitled Arthur Shuttlewood's Forgotten Warminster X-Files by Chip Norton, and then a video called the Warminster Thing UFO documentary on a wonderful YouTube channel called The Paranormal Scholar.
Oh, lovely.
Oh boy, I am ready to butter this toast and shove it into my mouth, because this is one hell of a story. This is a story I believe, Maureen, has a bit of an identity crisis.
Oh, okay, what do you mean?
I think most people are very quick to label this a UFO case, and while UFOs are involved, I think this might be something else entirely.
Oh, really?
UFOs are definitely central to the story, but part of me wonders if it ain't about something else. The story centers on what was going on in Warminster, UK, primarily in 1964 and 65, even though we will branch out beyond those years. Well, located outside of the western edge of Salisbury Plain, you'll find the ancient and charming town of Warminster. Located in the county of Wiltshire, Warminster itself sits at the head of a wooded area called the Wylye Valley. And just for perspective, Warminster is about a 2-hour drive southwest of London. As I said, Warminster indeed has an ancient history, with its origins dating all the way back to the Anglo-Saxons in the Iron Age.
Oh, wow.
In the 18th century, it became a boom town due to the wool and corn industries. But now let's go ahead and jump forward to when our story begins. The real start of the Warminster Thing began on Christmas Day, 1964, but before we begin there's also some strange things that happened in the town before then. Back in 1930, a truck driver happened to be passing through Warminster when he claimed to have come upon what appeared to be a strange black mist. When he drove through it, it was as if the mist clung to his truck. And the driver brought the truck to a halt, but that's when things got even weirder. He claims that from out of this black mist, a gray hand with long fingers appeared and grabbed him. Naturally, the driver began to struggle to get away, and as he did, the hand released him and vanished, as did the black mist.
Ooh.
Unexplained lights in the sky would often be reported in the area throughout the 1950s. But given the town's close proximity to an army base, perhaps that could explain some of these sightings. The military would often conduct drills out at Salisbury Plain. But in 1961, a group of hikers were out and about when they claimed to see a flying saucer zipping through the sky. They said it appeared to be emitting sparks behind it.
Oh.
And just for the sake of clarity, some of my sources will say this craft the hikers saw was actually cigar-shaped, but who's to say? There will be plenty of both saucer-shaped and cigar-shaped craft in this story.
Which we hear about a lot of both in really all UFO stories.
That's right. Now we come to Christmas Day, 1964, when things really kick off. It all begins with a gentleman named Roger Rump.
Oh, what a name.
One hell of a name. Roger Rump worked as the head postmaster there in Warminster. It was the early morning hours of Christmas Day, and Rump was just getting home after a very long shift at the post office on Christmas Eve the night before. Exhausted, Rump made his way inside his house, climbed up the stairs, and flopped down in bed, finally relieved and happy to finally be getting some rest. Just as he was about to fall asleep, there came a very loud clattering noise that seemed to be coming from up on the roof. Suddenly not tired anymore, Rump shot up straight in bed and listened. On top of this loud clattering was what he described as an unearthly droning or humming sound. Later, Rump was asked to describe the sound, and he said it sounded like, quote, "It sounded like all 5,000 roof tiles had been lifted up and then put back down again by an invisible force." And side note, Rump had apparently just reshingled his roof, so that's how he knew there were 5,000 tiles up there.
Oh my God. Okay, there you go.
He described it as a sort of loud scrambling noise, like tree branches being dragged across the roof, or like thousands of rats
Ew.
scratching up there.
Oh God, what the fuck?
Now, other folks across Warminster were having experiences right around this same time. At the nearby Camp Nook Army Base, 30 soldiers were startled awake when an unexplained loud noise swept through the base. They described it as if the foundation of the building had been torn from the ground and the masonry showered back down upon the base. Again, at about the same time, at around 6:30 a.m., a woman named Marjorie Bye was making her way to the local Christ Church for the Christmas morning service. Suddenly, Bye was overcome by what she described as an intense sound waves. They were like electrical sparks crackling through the air. She described it as like, quote, "a truck spreading grit on the road." But of course, much louder. The sound waves were so intense that Marjorie collapsed to the ground and claimed she was pinned there by what later sources would describe as invisible fingers of sound. Once the sound passed and she was able to get up, she rushed on over to the church for safety. Well, before we move on, something interesting to note is that earlier that morning at about 1:30 a.m., so 1:30 a.m. on Christmas morn, a Warminster local named Mildred Head said she was suddenly awakened by an intense sound. She described the sound as being like, quote, "wire of metal rods being dragged across her roof tiles, like giant hailstones." The sound was so intense, she had to cover her ears with her hands. She assumed it must be some sort of really crazy storm blowing through, so she got up from her bed and rushed to the window and to have a look, and of course, there was no storm. It was a clear night with not a cloud in the sky.
Very odd.
Very odd indeed. That following year, 1965, would only see these strange events increase in number and intensity. It wasn't long until whatever was causing these weird occurrences was nicknamed the Thing by the locals. On March 17th of 1965, a local woman named Joan Brown reported hearing an awful vibrating sound that seemed like it was going to pull the roof right off her house. The vibrating was so intense that her cat just about lost it and had vomited in every room of the house by the time it dissipated.
Oh God, that poor cat.
That poor cat. It's a lot of fur balls, baby. As 1965 went on, more and more of these occurrences happened to the point that a local man named Keith Palmer assembled what he called sky watchers. And this is just like it sounds. Locals would gather together to watch the sky for strange shit. They were often seen at one of the local hilltops, Cradle Hill, Clay Hill. We'll talk more about these hills in a bit.
Okay.
A few months later, on June 19th, a woman named Kathy Penton claimed she saw a cigar-shaped craft hovering above a hill near town. She said this craft appeared to have portholes on it that were illuminated from within. A few weeks later, on July 7th, a woman named Dora Horlock was awakened abruptly at 3:15 a.m. by an intense humming sound. She made her way to the bedroom window to have a look at what the hell was going on, and that's when she witnessed in the sky to the south a huge glowing red ball that simply appeared to be hovering in the sky. She described the craft as having a black base and that it made a strange sort of crackle and popping sound that she described as being like the crackling sound of bacon and eggs cooking. As we know, strange electric crackling noises are often cited as being attached to UFO occurrences.
Right.
A little over a month later, on August 10th, a woman named Rachel Atwell was abruptly awakened in horror at 4 a.m. She claimed it seemed as though her entire house was shaking. There soon followed a very loud droning noise. Like witnesses before her, Atwell rushed from her bed to the window and saw in the sky what she described as a bright object hovering above a nearby hilltop. This craft she described as having an illuminated dome. Elsewhere in Warminster, at nearly the exact same time, someone else was having an encounter themselves. It was about 4:36 a.m., and a truck driver named Terry Pell was with his wife and daughter, and they were making their way down Cop Heap Lane with a delivery of fruit destined for the ripening center located on that street. All of a sudden, Pell saw what seemed to be a brightly glowing orb hovering above the tree line. A moment later, Pell was startled when the object raced toward him in a flash. It stopped to hover about 50 yards from his truck. The truck began to shake, and it seemed like the windshield itself was going to burst. Keep in mind, this was all happening within moments of time, like from seeing it to when it, sped towards him. This is like a flash.
Oh my God.
The light was so blinding that Pell had to slam on the brakes to avoid getting in an accident. And he claims that it felt like it was going to push the truck right off the road. The thing he described as being about 40 feet wide. He held his wife and daughter, who were obviously terrified, and he tried to comfort them the best he could. After a moment, the strange orb took off in a flash and was gone. Thankfully, none of the Pells were hurt, just scared silly. That's another thing we see a lot is people driving.
Yeah.
We'll get more into that in a bit here.
That like a lot of these things happen while people are driving.
Yeah.
And not just in this story, just in lots of accounts of paranormal activity.
Exactly, right. Well, the next encounter would happen on the night of August 20th to a young couple who were out for a night on the town. Rob Payne, who worked and lived as a carpenter there in Warminster, he was taking out his sweetheart, a Wendy Gulliford, out on a date there in town. The two had a splendid romantic evening, and it was about 11:30 p.m. when the couple began driving back to Dilton Marsh, where Wendy lived with her parents. And it was a particularly creepy night that evening as the sky was overcast, blocking out the moon, and on top of that, there was low-hanging mists and fog just kind of blanketing the atmosphere, just blanketing the whole place in a spooky atmosphere. The couple turned a corner on Rob's scooter, he was driving a scooter, when all of a sudden the engine began to chug a lug and eventually cut out. How perfectly like a horror movie is this?
Yeah, oh my God.
Well, that was strange that the scooter would just give out like that. It had always run well and it had plenty of gas. So in the quiet of the night, the couple sat on the scooter as Rob fiddled with it, trying to get it going again. Suddenly, Wendy let out a piercing scream that echoed through the night. Rob nearly jumped out of his skin and looked up to see two very bright orbs hovering in the sky up the road above the fir trees at a place called Callaway Clump. Wendy had barely finished that scream when the orbs raced toward them in a flash. Wendy clung to Rob with all her strength, and the two were frozen there in fear. One of the orbs stopped a few yards ahead of them, hovering above the road. In later interviews with authorities, Rob would describe this thing not like a spacecraft or a flying saucer, but like a giant eyeball. A giant eyeball that somehow would crackle and pop with electrical discharges. The orbs then went on their way, leaving the couple awestruck in the dark, foggy night. After several moments, Rob gave the scooter another try, and it started up with no problem. How many times has that happened in stories where the car goes out first before they see anything, then they see anything, and then once it leaves, it starts again.
Starts up again.
Night of the Silver Man, countless things.
Yeah.
Now, while Warminster was certainly the hub of all this strange activity, by now the strangeness had begun to bleed out into other towns and villages in the surrounding area. On the night of September 13th, the village of Lulsgate Bottom near Bristol was paid a visit. A report published in the September 14th, 1965 edition of the Bristol Evening Post revealed that several local townsfolk reported seeing a strange blue light in the sky and an awful droning sound. While all this ruckus was going on, an insurance salesman named Ken Kimberly was on his way home returning from a business trip. It was about midnight, and as Kimberly drove down the A38 road, it was quiet and deserted. Suddenly, he came upon a patch of road that he described as being bathed in an eerie greenish-blue light. That was when the engine of his Bentley began to chug-a-lug.
Oh, no.
And all the electronics in the car went out. Right as the engine cut out, Kimberly claims there arose a very intense droning sound that he described as being like a jet engine. That's when the rear of his car began to violently bounce up and down. He described it as being like, quote, "An elephant was jumping up and down on the trunk."
An elephant, for Christ's sake. Kimberly
Dove out of his car, not knowing what the heck was going on, but the moment he did, it all stopped. The droning ceased, and the weird bluish light thing vanished, and Kimberly was definitely rattled, but at least he was safe. Something to just note, and we'll talk more about this later. Notice the UFOs and the strange sound never come together.
Okay.
The UFOs will make that crackle and pop sound, but this huge droning noise, you never actually see a UFO when it's going on. And we'll touch on that later.
Okay.
But while the thing did seem to take a brief trip over near Bristol, it returned to Warminster with a vengeance on December 3rd. A former matron by the name of Miss Eva Godwin was awakened at around 1 a.m. by what sounded like pebbles or rocks rolling across her roof. This was strange enough, but then came that very loud, humming, droning sound, and all of a sudden the house itself began to tremble. It was almost like poltergeist activity. Light fixtures rattled on the walls, curtain rods ripped off of the windows and were thrown about the room. The event went on for about 10 minutes and then abruptly stopped altogether. Miss Godwin had to pour herself a strong drink to calm her nerves.
Oh, gosh.
A few days later, on December 16th, a man named Reginald Roberts was out for a drive on a country road right near Warminster. It was about 8 p.m. Robert was enjoying his ride through the country when suddenly he had to slam on his brakes. Standing in the road in front of him was what Roberts would describe as a, quote, tall gray figure standing in the road. The creature was unlike anything he had ever seen. It was your typical description of a tall gray alien, but with what he described as streaming fair hair.
Oh.
And it seemed just as startled by him as he was of it. Right as Roberts got out of his car, the creature vanished. But in the air, he noted there was the strong smell of sulfur.
Oh, no.
That's another thing we see often.
Yeah, but sulfur, it's like...
That's more demonic.
Demonic, kind of.
Whereas aliens and stuff, it's more ozone.
But
Yeah.
I mean, you never know. I'm sure there's other cases of UFO cases where people smell sulfur, but...
Oh, yeah, and we've covered a few where there is.
Yeah, but just weird.
Now let's jump ahead about 4 months to April 1st of 1966. It's bright and early at about 4:45 a.m., and Christopher Hudd was just showing up to work with about 4 others of his fellow council workmates. The group was walking from their vehicles to their building when they all looked up to see a bright cigar-shaped object. It was headed silently over Cop Heap Hill to the east, when suddenly the cigar-shaped craft burst in a flash seeming to break up into 6 individual bright orbs. Their color then changed to a sort of silver and red, silver and crimson color, and they sped away to the north. Just 3 days later, a man, who the source only describes as an employee of the Bank of England, was driving about 2 miles away in the nearby town of Norton-Brabant, and he saw something very similar. At first he saw what looked like a cigar-shaped craft, then watched it sort of burst into 6 separate gold-colored orbs. He watched as 3 of the orbs just vanished right before his eyes, and the other 3 turned sort of incandescent and flew away in a flash towards Cradle Hill in Warminster. A few days later, on April 7th, 2 soldiers had an encounter. These men were part of the Welsh Regiment at the Battleberry Barracks located there in Warminster. The 2 were out and about when they saw in the sky a bright orb move quickly across the sky from east to west. So now we're seeing variations in the craft, and we've also seen grays.
Right, see, those gray aliens.
Escalating, it's escalating here. Now, the following year, on October 10th of 1967, 2 policemen were out on a patrol conducting routine checks of farm buildings near Warminster. They were Officers Roger Willey and Officer Clifford Waycott. Apparently, they had gotten a call that some animals had been spotted running down the road, so they went out there to see if they could determine which farm they had escaped from. It was about 4 a.m. when the 2 officers encountered a bright light in the sky. This UFO seemed to be following their police car until it completely passed over them, and they watched it rocket through the sky at astonishing speed. But later, though, when they filed their report, they were told to keep their experiences hush hush. A few years later, on August 13th of 1972, a group of sky watchers were up on Cradle Hill when they began to hear what sounded like a loud thumping sound nearby. It seemed to be coming from behind a hedge grove that was in a nearby field. They watched in awe as from behind this hedge emerged 3 very tall, humanoid figures that looked like your classic tall gray alien.
Oh no.
They were described as having, quote, large heads, long dangling arms, and wide shoulders. The witnesses claimed these figures turned partly transparent, and they watched them walk away until they vanished completely. As the decades have gone on, the sightings have grown less and less frequent, though they still occasionally happen. But the bulk of this flap happened between 1964 and 65. So now that we've gone over the timeline of weird occurrences,
Right.
let's break down these occurrences.
Okay.
And I want to start with what I find most fascinating about this case, the strange noise. Now, of course, these UFOs in the sky and these humanoid aliens are all very fascinating, but those aspects are a lot like other stories we've covered in the past. The noise is fascinating, though. The source makes a point of noting the thing was always heard before it was seen. In fact, for the most part, whenever folks saw one of these crafts or one of these orbs of light, they were either making an electrical popping and cracking noise, or they were silent altogether. Never is one of these things seen when people would experience that loud droning noise when it was like their houses were going to explode.
Right.
They might have seen a craft just before or just after, but never during. It makes me wonder if maybe they aren't 2 separate things. What if these strange craft are responding to these sonic events? Also, think about what the young couple Rob and Wendy said. They said they didn't see a craft. What they saw seemed to be an eye in the sky.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Let's say these crafts are actually secret government technology, but what are they? Are they responding to? Are they scrambling to respond to these strange sonic phenomena? Who knows? Now let's talk about these damn hills.
Yeah.
A lot of talk about these hills that are surround Warminster, like
A lot of chatter.
Cradle Hill, Clay Hill, and Cop Heap. A lot of UFO activity, these crafts and orbs especially, people would see in the sky seem to be either nearby or even directly above these hilltops. Clay Hill itself is actually an ancient Iron Age hill fort. Apparently, the ancient Anglo-Saxons believed the hill itself was created by the devil. It butts up against 4 ley lines that travel through the area.
Wow.
Remember what we know about ley lines. Some theorize that ley lines sort of work as roadmaps for UFOs. Well, in May of 1965, at the height of this whole Warminster UFO flap, locals reported what appeared to be a UFO firing torpedo-like objects into Clay Hill. A group of these skywalkers worked up the courage and went up that hill to investigate, bringing with them stuff like metal detectors and shit. And apparently they did find a metal object embedded in the ground, but they decided it was wise to just leave it be. Apparently, even the Rolling Stones paid a visit to Cradle Hill, though they didn't see anything, or as my source says, didn't get no satisfaction.
Oh, come on. Okay. All right.
Something else we need to talk about are the animals in and around Warminster, as they were apparently showing strange behavior throughout this whole time as well. During this UFO flap, people would often find tons of dead birds, inexplicably just laying all around. People reported that whole flocks of birds would suddenly drop dead out of the sky as if they were killed mid-flight, something else we've encountered with UFO tales. Many noted that their bodies seemed to go into an immediate state of rigor mortis.
Oh, wow.
What's also weird is that mice would be found dead. Oftentimes their bodies seem to be burned and riddled with holes.
Ew, what the fuck?
A family in Warminster who had a pet parrot said that right after one of those strange noise episodes, they found their parrot just laying dead in its cage with no reason for why it died. Cattle would suddenly stampede and burst out of their fences. Guard dogs were known to howl like crazy and cower under tables or in corners. And cats would apparently hiss and arch their backs like they could see something their humans could not. So we're seeing like weird blends of UFO but also poltergeist activity. Also, we need to briefly talk about a man named Arthur Shuttlewood. As you know, the title of my source has Arthur Shuttlewood in the title. This is because Shuttlewood is largely responsible for why many of us even know about the Warminster Thing to this day. He was an editor and a reporter for the Warminster Journal at the time of all the excitement. Starting off, Shuttlewood was a die-hard skeptic, but soon he was swept up in the fervor surrounding the Warminster Thing. He even claimed to have seen a cigar-shaped craft himself on Tuesday, September 28th at around 3:40 p.m., but it doesn't stop there. The source makes a point to take everything Shuttlewood says with a grain of salt. On one hand, Shuttlewood is the reason we know as much about the Warminster Thing as we do, but on the other hand, to quote my source, Shuttlewood sometimes tended to veer away from reality, and maybe as an attempt to make things more interesting, began writing about how an extraterrestrial named Calisan had tried to contact him.
Oh.
The superstructure of that science is dwarfing the other two sciences, which are spiritual and social. We're losing sight of spiritual and social sciences, which are creative. We don't know how to use their creations. So that the superstructure of the material science is in danger now of collapsing on top of the other two. And if that happens, well, we've finished as a world. And they know that, so I think that there's something here that's a little bit religious. They're here, they tell me. They're not the only planet engaged in this operation, but it is an operation, and apparently it's by divine guidance that they're here. They're not allowed under universal law to actually come down among us and tell us exactly what's wrong, but they have to give pointers, and they allege that they have in fact contacted the governments of all the leading nations on this earth, that's the nuclear powers obviously, and that these governments know who they are, they know what their primary purposes and aims are in coming to Earth, and I've quoted these certain dates on which certain things are alleged to have happened around here, and definitely nothing to do with the military, no accidents reported or anything like that from the police. So far as I'm concerned, and I'm convinced now, having watched them every night for the past 9 months, these things, on clear nights, they've been ever since February the 25th, on Cradle Hill, we've seen them above us hovering, as though saying, well, here we are, you know? And I've no doubt in my mind now that these are interplanetary or extraterrestrial or whatever you want to call them. They're certainly not of this Earth.
He said he began to receive mysterious phone calls in September of 1965. The one calling him was apparently named Calisan, who claimed to be the chief of their spaceship. They claimed to be from a distant planet called Anestria. On the ship with Calisan was an interpreter named Sir Loric and Trailison, the queen of Anestra. Shuttlewood claims he was skeptical and had the phone call traced, and strangely, the call led back to a payphone not far from his home. Then, not long after, there came a knock at his door when he said, because he planned to meet up with Calisan. Well, suddenly there came a knock at his door, and when he opened it, standing there was a man in a wig and makeup wearing women's clothing.
Oh.
So even Shuttlewood thought maybe this call was a hoax himself.
Right.
And this is where it's weird. Apparently he attracted a lot of wackos, some legitimate folks, but then just some eccentrics or some people wanting to hoax him. Once he became known as the UFO journalist guy, people from all around, some people trying to hoax him, some people seriously with serious reports, some people maybe are just ill, shit like that.
Right.
In January of 1968, when a lot of the flap was finally dying down, Shuttlewood published a report update on the local UFO events. In it, he interviews a witness who claimed to have seen what appeared to be a small flying saucer only about the size of a dinner plate. He saw it land in a field near the village of Heaven's Gate. Shout out to Heaven's Gate, the cult. Well, not shout out in a good way,
But you know what we mean.
The witness claimed to have seen what appeared to be a small golden ladder emerge from the underside of this saucer, and down it emerged 20 or more alien creatures that were only about 4 inches tall or so. Much different than the really tall gray humanoids we've already seen in this story.
Right.
Now, folks may think that sounds a little strange, but the source itself actually lists a bunch of other UK examples of very popular UFO sightings that included mini, small aliens.
Right.
But one of the most famous is actually happened right here in the USA, the Kelly Hopkinsville encounter in Kentucky. A very famous case we cannot wait to cover. And when you see the drawings people have made of these entities, they do look shockingly similar. Now, as the years wore on, Shuttlewood's claims just got more and more bizarre. In April of 1972, Shuttlewood appeared on a BBC documentary entitled Pie in the Sky, where he was pressed pretty harshly by the reporter. Yet Shuttlewood remained insistent that he had not only seen UFOs himself, but also numerous entities that he referred to as extra-dimensional beings.
Ooh.
He claimed that they were just as frightened of us as we were of them, saying, quote, "You could shine a torch at them and these ghost-like beings would vanish and then reappear standing right next to you. They're semi-transparent, about 8 feet tall, dressed in one-piece gray suits, had no necks, and they had very long dangling arms." Interesting. Later on in 1977, Shuttlewood would say in an interview that he had even been levitated once by these beings. He saw a great light in a tree, and before he knew it, he was levitating. But he says he didn't feel afraid. No, in fact, he felt a sense of peace. Even after retiring, Shuttlewood continued to research the thing, but had to stop after a series of mini-strokes that left him debilitated. By the time he passed away in 1996, he had published 6 books on UFOs and given countless interviews. It should be noted that especially in the early days of the Warminster Flap, Shuttlewood got most of his info from a witness and foot doctor named Dr. David Holton, who lived in the village of Cockerton, which is only about 2 miles outside of Warminster. Despite being a doctor, Holton was apparently quite fringe in many of his beliefs, and it's also possible he was a bit wacky. He had an obsession with the paranormal and the unexplained, which obviously doesn't make you wacky, but apparently he might himself have just been a little wacky. And he stressed to Shuttlewood that there was an impending invasion of Warminster about to take place by these extraterrestrials. In fact, the source says Holton was the first to attach the strange noises with UFOs. Perhaps they were never associated in the first place. In mid-February of 1965, Holton claimed a massive flock of pigeons lay dead in the street, had been killed by sonic sound waves. Now, while no one knows why the birds did die, they also have no idea that it was done by sonic sound waves. In fact, on August 27th of 1965, a town meeting was held in an effort to calm the local residents who had grown panicked about all these strange events in town. And Emmeline Reese, the head of the Chamber of Commerce in Warminster, even invited David Holton to attend, but Holton unceremoniously refused. It's assumed that he didn't trust the local government. He later told Shuttlewood that he had burned over 200 letters from various folks in the area who had confided in him about their UFO experiences. The reason why we have included this is because it's very likely that Dr. Holton was a wacko that sort of captivated Shuttlewood, and so a lot of his wild tales might have thus poisoned his reporting. We hear about disinformation agents quite a bit.
We sure do.
And maybe that was intentional. Who
It's
knows?
possible. It's very possible.
Maybe the intent of Dr. Holton was to spread disinformation so that Shuttlewood wouldn't know what was right, what was real, and what wasn't real.
Right.
We hear that all the time.
We sure do.
Well, And that's why I think, what I find so fascinating is maybe these sounds have nothing to do with these UFO events.
Right.
Keep in mind, Stonehenge is only about 15 miles away from Warminster.
Oh.
Stonehenge, with all of its own weird things that are attached to it, it's ancient, how did they build it, all that shit. UFOs have often been spotted around it. Does it have something to do with this? Maybe these UFOs in the sky aren't related to these sounds. Maybe this is some ancient old god, an ancient deity that's rattling chains and shaking houses and scaring people.
Oh, that's so fascinating. What a crazy, crazy story. Let us know what you think. What do you think is going on here in Warminster? Let us know. You can DM us on any of our socials, or you can email us at creepstreetpodcast@gmail.com.
That's right, very Lovecraftian in a way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, let me tell you something. Let me give you some names who I wouldn't mind shaking our house.
Oh, please. You know I love it when this happens.
And of course, we got a new one, baby.
Woo.
Of course, the Dream, James Watkins, the Finnish face via Lungfist, the Madman Marcus Hall, the vivacious Vicky McHugh, the tenacious Teresa Hackworth, the Heartbreak Kid, Chris Hackworth, the oh-so-suave Sean Richardson, the British bone breaker, Bex Martin, the notorious Nicholas Barker, the terrifying Taylor Lashmet, the Count of Cool, Cameron Corliss, the Archduke of Attitude, Adam Archer, the sinister Sam Kiker, the Nightmare of New Zealand, Noeline Vivilli, the loathsome Johnny Love, the carnivorous Kevin Bogey, the killer stud, Carl Staub, the fire starter, Heather Carter, the conqueror, Christopher Damian Damaris, the awfully awesome Annie, the murderous Maggie Leach, the Sir of Sexy, Sam Hackworth. Also, happy birthday, Sammy. His birthday was on May 29th. Big happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
The evil Elizabeth Riley, Lauren Hellfire Hernandez Lopez, the maniacal Laura Maynard, the vicious Karen Van Buren, and the newcomer, the arch nemesis, Aaron Burr.
Wow, Aaron, you are so welcome. We are so happy to have you here. You are an absolute treasure, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yes. Thank you. Enjoy all those goodies. Welcome to the club. And of course, if you want to be just like Aaron and the rest of those awesome folks, go to patreon.com/creepstreetpodcast.
That is right. Thank you all so much for joining us. Feel free to like, rate, subscribe, comment, do any of those fun things that keeps us going. You can also follow us on social media, Creep Street Podcast or Creep Street Pod. You can email us at any time at creepstreetpodcast@gmail.com. And we are so happy to have you with us.
Citizens of the Milky Way, my name is Dylan Hackworth.
I'm Maureen Bogey.
Good night and goodbye.
Goodbye.